What happens when a verdict is delivered, but the ending never arrives? For most people, a sentence is something that concludes. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. But for those confined to death row, the sentence becomes something else entirely. It becomes a condition, a permanent psychological state, a life measured not by years, but by uncertainty. This is future verdicts. Before the headlines, before the final rulings, before the day, the world expects everything to be over. There is the waiting. And it is here, in this suspended reality, that the mind begins to change. From the moment a death sentence is pronounced, time no longer behaves the way it once did. Days stretch unnaturally long, while years seem to vanish without warning. There is no countdown clock, no fixed date to brace against. Instead, there is a quiet awareness that at some unknown moment in the future, everything could stop, or it might not. Appeals may delay it, courts may intervene, or they may not. The uncertainty becomes the punishment. Inside death row confinement, routines are rigid and repetitive. Meals arrive at the same hours. Lights switch on and off according to schedules decided by others. Conversations are limited. Movement is controlled. And yet, the most powerful force acting on the individual is invisible. It is the mind's constant attempt to make sense of an ending that refuses to take shape. Psychologists describe this as anticipatory stress, an ongoing state of heightened mental tension caused not by an event itself, but by the prolonged expectation of it. Unlike fear that peaks and passes, this form of stress lingers. It embeds itself into daily thought patterns. Over time, it reshapes how a person perceives reality. Hope becomes dangerous. Despair becomes familiar. Some individuals attempt to mentally prepare for an outcome that may never come. Others stop imagining the future altogether. Birthdays lose meaning. Seasons blur. Years are marked not by milestones, but by court dates that arrive and fade with no resolution. Each legal delay brings relief, and with it, a renewed reminder that the waiting continues. This is not a story about innocence or guilt. It is not an argument for or against capital punishment. This is an examination of what prolonged uncertainty does to the human mind when escape is impossible and the future is undefined. Studies have shown that extended isolation combined with unresolved anticipation can lead to emotional numbness, chronic anxiety, and cognitive fatigue. Memory fragments. Concentration weakens. The mind, in self-defense, begins to shut doors. Not all at once but slowly, quietly over years. And perhaps the most unsettling aspect of pre-execution confinement is not the fear of death itself, but the loss of identity that occurs along the way. When every day looks the same, when personal agency disappears, individuals often begin to define themselves solely by their sentence. Not who they were, not who they might have been, only what they are waiting for. In this environment, time is no longer neutral. It becomes an adversary. Some describe waking each morning with a brief moment of normalcy, followed instantly by the realization that nothing has changed. Others report the opposite, an ever-present awareness that never allows the mind to rest. Either way, the psychological toll accumulates. Quietly, invisibly, relentlessly. This is the side of death row rarely shown. Not the dramatic moments, not the final days, but the years in between where life continues, yet feels permanently paused. And as this chapter closes, one question lingers. If the punishment is death, what happens when the waiting becomes the punishment instead? In the next chapter, we will step deeper into this suspended world, examining how prolonged uncertainty reshapes emotion, decision-making, and the human sense of time itself. Before we continue, take a moment. If this documentary challenges the way you think about the justice system, like this video. If you value in-depth, human-centered investigations, subscribe to the channel. And if you believe these stories deserve to be examined with honesty and care, share this documentary so it reaches others. Because the verdict may be final, but the consequences continue long after the sentence is spoken. This is Future Verdicts. Time is supposed to move forward. It's a measure of growth, progress, and change. But inside the walls of death row, time loses its natural rhythm. It stretches, compresses, and fractures in ways that few of us can truly understand. For those awaiting execution, time is no longer a measure of life lived. It becomes a constant, haunting reminder of a life suspended. At first, many try to count it. Days until the next appeal, weeks until a legal update, months until another review. But as the delays accumulate and years bleed into one another, calendars lose their meaning. The mind begins to grasp a terrifying reality. No amount of counting brings certainty. The future doesn't approach, it just hovers indefinitely. Psychologists call this phenomenon temporal distortion. It's a condition where prolonged, intense uncertainty disrupts the brain's ability to perceive time accurately. Minutes feel like hours. Entire years can disappear in a blur. Memory stops organizing itself in a straight line. Instead of remembering when something happened, individuals remember how it felt, and what it feels like is waiting endlessly, without resolution. In most stressful situations, the human mind relies on a clear endpoint to cope. Even intense fear is more manageable when we know it has a conclusion. But on death row, there is no fixed endpoint. Execution dates are set, postponed, overturned, and then reinstated. Each change reopens psychological wounds that never have a chance to heal. The mind learns a dangerous lesson. Nothing is permanent, not even finality. This constant state of limbo can trigger extreme mental alertness, as if bracing for an impact that never arrives. Sleep becomes shallow and unrefreshing. Thoughts loop endlessly, replaying the same anxieties and what-ifs. The future is imagined in fragments, only to be abandoned because planning feels pointless and hope feels far too risky. Others experience a kind of emotional flattening. Joy becomes muted. Grief feels distant. This isn't apathy. It's a form of adaptation. The brain, overwhelmed by the prolonged anticipation of an unknown fate, starts to limit its emotional exposure as a defense mechanism. It's a desperate act of self-preservation. But this emotional shutdown comes at a steep cost. When feelings are suppressed for long periods, the ability to reconnect with them weakens. Relationships with family and friends suffer. Conversations become shallow. Even cherished memories of loved ones can lose their clarity, not because they are forgotten, but because recalling them brings a sharp pain the mind no longer wants to process. This is where isolation amplifies everything. Death row confinement often means severe restrictions on social interaction and movement. When you combine this intense isolation with temporal distortion, the internal dialogue becomes deafening. Thoughts echo in the silence. Regrets resurface with punishing regularity. Questions with no answers play on an endless loop. The mind becomes both the prison and the only possible escape. Experts have observed that this prolonged confinement under an unresolved death sentence can fundamentally alter decision-making patterns. Some individuals become hyper-focused on small, mundane routines, making their bed a certain way, timing their meals precisely. They cling to this rigid structure as a way to reclaim a tiny piece of control in a life that has none. Others withdraw completely, minimizing their engagement with the world around them as much as possible. Both are desperate attempts to survive psychologically, but survival does not mean healing. As the years pass, a person's very identity begins to erode. When your future is legally undefined, your sense of self becomes anchored solely to your sentence. Past achievements, personal passions, and relationships start to feel irrelevant. Personal growth feels impossible. The present becomes a directionless holding space, a waiting room with no exit. And perhaps the most unsettling part of this entire process is how normal it all begins to feel. What once seemed unbearable slowly becomes routine. The mind adapts, not because the situation improves, but because it has no other choice. This normalization of extreme uncertainty is one of the most profound psychological consequences of pre-execution confinement. It allows people to continue existing in conditions that would otherwise be completely overwhelming. But we should not mistake this adaptation for resilience. Behind the daily routine is a deep, silent exhaustion. It's a mental fatigue that builds quietly over years, a weariness caused not by physical labor, but by sustained anticipation without any release. This is the hidden cost of waiting. And it raises an uncomfortable question for all of us. If time itself becomes distorted, if identity dissolves, if emotion is dulled simply to endure what remains of the person who entered death row all those years earlier. In the next chapter, we will examine how this prolonged waiting reshapes memory, relationships, and the fragile connection to the outside world, revealing how psychological confinement extends far beyond the prison walls. Before we continue, take a moment. If this documentary is expanding your understanding of the justice system, please like this video. If you want more in-depth, carefully researched documentaries like this one, subscribe to our channel. And if you believe these conversations matter, share this episode so it can reach a wider audience. Because the longest sentence isn't always written in law. Sometimes, it's written in time. This is Future Verdicts. When time loses meaning, identity is often the next thing to fade. For individuals living under prolonged pre-execution confinement, the erosion of self doesn't happen all at once. There's no single moment when a person realizes they are changing. Instead, it unfolds gradually, almost invisibly, shaped by repetition, isolation, and the absence of a future that can be imagined with any certainty. In the outside world, our identities are reinforced daily. We define ourselves through our roles as a parent, a worker, a friend, a partner, through the choices we make and the plans we pursue, through progress, even when it's slow. But on death row, the very structure that supports identity collapses. Decisions are severely limited, roles are stripped away. The future is no longer something to build toward, but something to endure. Over time, many individuals begin to describe themselves not by who they are, but by where they are and why. The sentence becomes their identity. Everything else just recedes into the background. Psychologists have noted that when autonomy is removed for extended periods, the mind often compensates by narrowing its focus. Attention shifts inward. Thoughts begin to circle the same questions over and over. Who was I before this? Does that person still exist? And does it even matter anymore? Memory, which was once a refuge, becomes unreliable. Some memories might grow unusually vivid moments frozen in time, replayed with an almost obsessive clarity. Others fade unexpectedly, losing their detail and emotional weight. This fragmentation isn't random. The mind prioritizes what feels safest to remember and quietly lets go of what causes too much pain. Family memories can be especially difficult. Photographs arrive years apart, showing faces that have aged. Children grow up through descriptions rather than presence. Relationships are maintained through limited communication, often constrained by rules, schedules, and distance. Over time, maintaining that emotional closeness requires an effort that the mind, already under immense strain, may struggle to sustain. For some, detachment becomes a form of protection. When connection only brings reminders of a life that can never be returned to, emotional distance can feel safer. But this detachment comes with heavy consequences. As bonds weaken, so does the sense of belonging. The individual becomes increasingly isolated, not just physically, but psychologically. This isolation reshapes how people see themselves. Without consistent feedback from the outside world, self-perception becomes unstable. Identity is no longer reflected back through relationships or achievements. Instead, it's shaped by confinement, routine, and constant uncertainty. The question, "Who am I?" becomes harder and harder to answer with each passing year. And yet, the human need for meaning doesn't just disappear. Even in extreme confinement, the mind searches for purpose. Some find it in routine clean reading, exercising within a very limited space. Others turn inward, reflecting endlessly on the past. A few attempt to redefine themselves through learning, correspondence, or creative expression, despite the constraints. These efforts aren't really about transformation. They are about preservation. Because the greatest psychological threat of prolonged death row confinement is not fear, it's erasure. The slow, creeping feeling of becoming invisible, forgotten by time, reduced to a case number, a file, a sentence that was spoken long ago. What makes this so powerful is how quietly it all happens. There are no alarms, no dramatic collapse, just a gradual thinning of identity, like a photograph that's been left too long in the sun. And the longer the waiting continues, the harder it becomes to imagine a self that exists beyond it. This raises a profound question not just about punishment, but about humanity itself. If a person exists for decades in a state where growth is impossible, autonomy is removed, and the future is undefined, what responsibility does society bear for what that existence becomes? In the next chapter, we will examine how prolonged pre-execution confinement reshapes emotional bonds, communication, and the fragile connection between death row and the outside world, revealing how psychological confinement extends far beyond the prison walls. Before we continue, just pause for a moment. If this documentary is challenging the way you think about identity, justice, and confinement, please like this video. If you want more deeply researched, human-centered documentaries, subscribe to the channel. And if you believe these stories deserve careful attention, share this documentary so others can engage with it. Because the sentence doesn't only affect the body behind bars, it reshapes the mind that must live with it. This is Future Verdicts. Human beings are not meant to exist in isolation. Connection is how our identity is reinforced, how memory stays alive, how reality remains grounded. But inside prolonged pre-execution confinement, connection becomes fragile, strained by time, distance, and deep psychological exhaustion. It's a slow erosion of the very thing that makes us feel human. At first, contact with the outside world can feel like an anchor. Letters arrive, visits are scheduled, voices on the phone remind individuals that life continues beyond the walls. For a moment, there is a sense of normalcy, a feeling of belonging, proof that someone remembers who they were before the sentence. These early connections are lifelines, tethering a person to their past and to a world they still consider their own. But as years stretch into decades, maintaining that connection becomes a monumental task. The conversations start to repeat themselves. News from the outside world accelerates at a dizzying pace, while life inside remains frozen in an unchanging routine. Technology evolves. Cultural references shift. The gap between life beyond the walls and life within them grows wider, creating a sense of displacement that is almost impossible to articulate. Imagine trying to explain your world to someone who lives in a completely different century. That's the feeling. For many, this creates a painful contradiction. Connection brings comfort, but it also brings sharp, piercing reminders of everything that has been lost. Missed milestones like weddings, births, and graduations. Family events experienced only through secondhand stories. Relationships that evolve and change without your physical presence. Over time, each phone call, each letter, can feel like reopening a wound that never fully heals. The joy of hearing a loved one's voice is mixed with the agony of their absence. Psychologists observe that prolonged confinement under this kind of unresolved uncertainty often leads to emotional withdrawal. This isn't because individuals stop caring. It's because caring becomes emotionally costly. The mind, in an act of self-preservation, begins to ration connection as a way to maintain some semblance of stability. It's a survival mechanism, but one with devastating consequences. This withdrawal is rarely a conscious decision. It starts subtly. The phone calls become shorter. Letters are delayed, not out of neglect, but out of an inability to find the words. Visits, which were once a source of comfort, start to feel emotionally draining. The individual may begin to believe that distancing themselves is an act of kindness, protecting their loved ones from the constant pain of their situation. Or, they might be trying to protect themselves from the constant, brutal reminders of their separation. But this distance has severe consequences. As communication fades, so does the sense of being part of a larger world. The outside becomes abstract, a story you hear about but no longer belong to. Loved ones start to feel like characters in a memory rather than active participants in your life. This detachment deepens the psychological isolation, reinforcing the feeling of existing outside of time and outside of society. You're not just behind walls, you're adrift in a void. Inside confinement, communication is already strictly limited by rules, schedules, and surveillance. When emotional withdrawal is added to those restrictions, the silence grows louder, thoughts go unchallenged, doubts multiply. The mind turns inward, often revisiting the same unanswerable questions over and over again. Am I still remembered? Do I still matter? Who am I to the people I can no longer reach? These questions don't demand answers. They just linger, hanging in the silence, eroding a person's sense of self. Experts note that this kind of profound social disconnection can intensify feelings of invisibility and emotional numbness. Without regular affirmation from others, without being seen and heard, a person's self-worth becomes incredibly hard to sustain. Identity, already fragile, weakens even further. You start to wonder if you exist at all. And yet, the fundamental human desire for connection never fully disappears. Even those who have withdrawn emotionally often remain acutely aware of the outside world. They listen for the sound of footsteps in the hall. They wait for the mail cart, hoping for a letter. They measure time not by calendars or clocks, but by moments of contact, no matter how rare or fleeting they become. This constant tension between longing for connection and avoiding its pain creates a state of chronic emotional fatigue. Caring hurts, but not caring feels empty. There is no relief, no safe harbor in either direction. It's a psychological catch-22 from which there is no escape. As the years continue to pass, some individuals report feeling as though they exist between worlds, no longer fully part of the outside, yet never fully adjusted to the stark reality within. This psychological limbo deepens the sense of being suspended, untethered from both a past you can't return to and a future you can't imagine. It is the ultimate state of being in between. And this effect doesn't stop at the prison walls. Families, too, experience unimaginable psychological strain. Relationships are forced to adapt under immense pressure. Roles shift. A spouse becomes a single parent. Children grow up with a parent who is more of a voice on the phone than a physical presence. The distance reshapes bonds in ways that cannot always be repaired. Prolonged waiting affects everyone connected to the sentence, extending the psychological impact far beyond the individual in confinement. This leads us to a critical realization. Pre-execution confinement is not an individual experience. It is a shared psychological burden carried by those inside and by those who remain connected to them on the outside. And as that connection weakens, the burden on everyone grows heavier. When external connection fades, one final defense often remains: internal control. In the next chapter, we will examine how individuals attempt to regain control over their inner world, how routines, rituals, and mental boundaries become essential survival tools in an environment defined by unending uncertainty. Before we continue, pause for a moment. If this documentary is helping you see the human side of prolonged confinement, please like this video. If you value thoughtful, deeply researched storytelling, subscribe to the channel. And if you believe these conversations deserve a broader audience, share this documentary so it can reach others. Because when connection fades, the consequences do not simply vanish, they echo. This is Future Verdicts. In a world where every day feels uncertain, survival is more than physical. It's psychological. It's the mind's quiet rebellion against an existence measured by anticipation, not fulfillment. For those on death row, years, or even decades, are lived under conditions that challenge every instinct of identity, memory, and connection. But amid the relentless tension, the human spirit does what it always does. It seeks control. Even when the outcome is entirely out of one's hands, individuals find ways to assert agency, however small, over their inner worlds. Routines become lifelines. Simple tasks like making a bed, maintaining a personal space, or exercising within the constraints of a cell are transformed into anchors of stability. These routines aren't merely habits. They are acts of defiance against a reality designed to strip autonomy away. Some turn to mental disciplines. Meditation, visualization, even structured thought exercises provide an illusory control over time. By consciously shaping the mind's focus, individuals attempt to create a framework in which life continues to have meaning. While the world outside may remain unpredictable, the inner world can be, for a moment, ordered. Others cling to creative expression. Letters, journals, sketches, or improvised writings become both confession and testament. They document what it means to exist under unresolved anticipation, preserving fragments of identity before time and isolation erode them. Through creativity, the mind asserts, I am still here, I still exist, I still matter. Hope, though fragile, also survives. It may take the form of delayed appeals, rare moments of human contact, or the belief that understanding can emerge from observation. Hope doesn't require certainty. It doesn't need a guarantee. It simply demands attention, a quiet refusal to surrender entirely to despair. Psychologists studying death row confinement note that survival strategies are often a blend of acceptance and action. Individuals don't necessarily overcome the psychological strain. They adapt to it. They learn to live within the tension, maintaining mental equilibrium while navigating perpetual uncertainty. Yet even adaptation has its limits. The prolonged suspension of an outcome, the endless waiting, remains an ongoing stressor. Anxiety, emotional fatigue, and subtle identity erosion persist, demanding continuous coping. Survival isn't triumph. It's resilience maintained under pressure. Despite the constraints, the human mind demonstrates an extraordinary capacity to retain meaning. Some individuals establish internal narratives to preserve their sense of self. They recall achievements, relationships, or experiences that predate their confinement. They imagine alternative futures. They measure life by internal milestones, rather than external events. These strategies reveal the profound complexity of human psychology. When faced with extreme conditions, the mind simultaneously retreats and reaches outward. Isolation fosters introspection. Confinement strengthens awareness of time and mortality. Uncertainty sharpens perception. The psychological toll is immense, but the capacity for endurance is equally remarkable. And this endurance is not a private phenomenon. Families, supporters, and communities share in the consequences of prolonged uncertainty. Letters and visits, however limited, provide crucial lifelines of mutual resilience. Each connection, however tenuous, reinforces identity and preserves humanity. This chapter, and this documentary, cannot capture every nuance of a life suspended by pre-execution confinement. No description can fully convey the slow passage of time, the subtle erosion of self, or the quiet victories of the mind asserting agency. Yet understanding these experiences is essential. It reminds us that every human being, regardless of circumstance, carries a complex interior world, full of memory, emotion, and thought. By examining how individuals navigate extreme psychological pressure, we are forced to confront broader questions about justice, punishment, and the human spirit. If time itself can become a sentence, what responsibility does society bear for the mental lives of those who endure it? How do we reconcile legal finality with prolonged psychological suffering? And what lessons can be drawn about resilience, identity, and the capacity for hope in the most uncertain of conditions? As this series concludes, one reality becomes clear. The waiting doesn't only shape a sentence, it shapes the person serving it. Identity, memory, emotion, and hope are all tested, altered, and preserved in ways that few outside can truly comprehend. Before this chapter ends, take a moment. Reflect on what you have seen. Consider the invisible toll of waiting, the quiet endurance of those confined, and the resilience of the human mind. If this documentary has changed the way you understand incarceration, like this video. If you value in-depth, human-centered investigative storytelling, subscribe to the channel. And if these stories deserve a wider audience, share this documentary so more people can witness the psychological journey behind the sentence. Because justice is more than verdicts. It's also the unseen struggle to survive under time's relentless uncertainty. This is Future Verdicts.